G'day everyone, Jamie Chapman for another episode of 3-Minute Histology. Today we're going to be talking about pre-antral follicles. Now, you may not have any idea what that means, and because there's variation out there in the textbooks about classification of follicles, different types of follicles are classified differently in different textbooks. We're going to be starting off this without looking at the section by having an understanding about follicle classification and what I'm talking about. So of course we've got pre-antral follicles. Those are the follicles which have not yet developed the fluid filled space antrum, and antral follicles. And so we'll talk about how I classify those. So for me, the pre-antral follicles are the primordial follicles, and the primordial follicles of course are the little follicles which are the store of non-growing follicles within the ovary, and then the primary follicles. And now primary can be further subdivided based on the number of layers of granulosa cells around them. If it's just one layer, then they're known as unilaminar primary follicles. Unilaminar means single layer. Or if more than one layer exists, then they're known as multilaminar primary follicles. Now just be aware that the textbooks may classify these a little bit differently. So some textbooks classify primordial and primary as being a single layer of granulosa cells, and then when they become multiple layers of granulosa cells, they're sometimes referred to as secondary follicles. Here, however, a secondary follicle for me is going to be a follicle which has an antrum. It's just begun to develop an antrum. So a secondary follicle is our first antral follicle, and then if it gets picked up by FSH, then it may become a pre-ovulatory follicle. Now, pre-ovulatory follicles are often referred to as Graafian follicles as well. So, I'm not sure exactly where the umlauts go over Graafian, named after Van der Graaf. So, today we're going to be looking at this part of our classification. We're going to be looking at the pre-antral follicular development. So here's our histological section of our ovary. So let's start the official 3 minutes then. So the two follicles which we just mentioned are the primordial and the primary follicles, and I mentioned there are two types of primary. So if we zoom in here, we can actually see all of these primordial follicles. These are typically found in the outermost part of the ovarian cortex. They're characterized by having this large circular oocyte, which is a primary oocyte arrested at prophase 1 of meiosis 1, and surrounded by a single layer of flattened squamous follicle cells. You can see the squamous follicle cells here. At this stage, they're not referred to as granulosa cells, but when the primordial follicle is stimulated to undergo development, those follicle cells become granulosa cells, and they form this single layer of cuboidal, simple cuboidal epithelium. So these granulosa cells. So here's our oocyte. You can see one of the there's sort of two consequences that happen during this early follicular development, this pre-antral follicular development. One is the oocyte grows. The second is the follicle cells grow. So the follicle cells differentiate into granulosa cells and begin to form this single layer of cuboidal granulosa cells. Now, sitting on the outside of that, the granulosa cells are actually sitting on a basement membrane. You can't really see it in normal H&E staining conditions. And then external to that, we have the stromal cells. And, the stromal cells actually begin to differentiate as the development grows as well. So here's a multilaminar. So this is a unilaminar primary follicle, and then here's a multilaminar primary follicle. So here's our oocyte. You can see it's increased in size quite considerably. It's secreted a glycoprotein coat around the outside. This is known as the zona pellucida. And then we've got our multiple layers of granulosa cells. So this is a multilaminar primary follicle. Now, sitting outside there is a basement membrane, and you might notice these cells have sort of look like they're sort of enveloping and encasing the outer part of this follicle. These are known as thecal cells, and these will eventually differentiate into two layers. The innermost layer closest to the basement membrane are known as the theca interna cells, and then anchoring the follicle to the surrounding stroma, this is all the stroma out here, are the theca externa cells. So that's our primordial development into a primary follicle, a unilaminar primary follicle that continues development into a multilaminar primary follicle, and then eventually what will happen is that these granulosa cells will begin to secrete fluid, which moves them into the next stage of antral follicular development, which we'll look at in the next video. Anyway, I hope you found that useful, identifying these different features. Hooroo!